Hello and welcome to Behind the Headlines. This is for Wednesday the 12th of October 2022, and in this programme we will be discussing the possibility that our new Prime Minister Liz Truss may move the British Embassy from where it's located now in Herzliya in Israel to Jerusalem. And this has already caused a political storm, but it now seems that Christian faith leaders across the country are condemning this move, but has serious spiritual implications for our nation. And if we believe what it says in Genesis 12, 1-3, that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you, if Liz Truss has the courage and the determination to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem, then this will command a spiritual blessing for our nation. But we're asking, why are our religious leaders, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, telling our Prime Minister she should not move the embassy? Reagan, it's great to be doing a topic, particularly on one of my favourite topics, which is Israel, but Jerusalem. And to think that a few years ago, the prospect of the British Embassy being moved from where it is now in Herzliya to Jerusalem, and for the British government to recognise Israeli sovereignty over their eternal city, Jerusalem, would be absolutely unheard of or unthinkable. And already, sadly, we're seeing so many Christian leaders condemning this potential move, which would deny our nation a blessing. Just makes me think, are these religious leaders like the Archbishop of Canterbury on a collision course with the God of Israel?
Well, I remember doing a program, I think it may have been Politics Today with you, when the United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and there was massive controversy and furor over that. There was widespread condemnation from people, especially in the UK, over that move. I believe even members of government at the time were very critical of it, but thankfully, we have seen in the past few years with Boris Johnson's government, certainly the then Home Secretary, I believe, Priti Patel, she has been very pro-Israel as well. And now it's, to me, maybe somewhat surprising that Liz Truss is wanting to go there. She's wanting to actually move the British Embassy from Herzliya, beautiful place, by the way, nothing against Herzliya, but to Jerusalem, in what would be an incredibly significant and highly symbolic move of respect for the nation state of Israel and the Jewish people. I think it's an absolute tragedy that we have two men who are in leadership of a very, very high regarded church bodies, the Church of England and of course the Roman Catholic Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of Westminster, both of whom are in the headlines as cautioning and expressing concern and fear over this move. And these should be men who are at the very forefront of saying, yes, this is a good move, this is a righteous and just move. If they're going to be saying anything at all, certainly that's what they should say, but they've not done that. They've spoken out against Liz Truss on this. A spokesperson for Justin Welby said that he was concerned about all the potential impact before a, quote, negotiated settlement between Palestinians and Israelis has been reached, as if this has not been something that's gone on for decades and will it will go on until Christ returns. The most senior Catholic in England, Cardinal Vincent Nichols, also wrote to Ms. Truss to say he can, quote, see no valid reason why a move needs now to be considered, and that it would be seriously damaging to any possibility of lasting peace in the region and to the international reputation of the United Kingdom. Very harsh criticism and very concerning. It shows, I believe, a short-sighted lack of respect and certainly unbiblical disregard for Jerusalem and its place.
Absolutely. I mean, if we talk about Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is God's eternal city. I mean, it's mentioned throughout the Old Testament, it's mentioned throughout the New Testament. Jesus had his own ministry there. It's been the capital for the Jewish people worldwide for over 4,000 years when King David made it his kingdom. And then, of course, Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, followed by the second temple. And we now see that through biblical prophecy, when Israel became a modern state and was reborn again on the 14th of May 1948, half of Jerusalem was in Israel's hands. And then, of course, we saw the prophetic events of June 1967 with the Six-Day War. And this is when the old city and the Jewish holy sites fell back into Jewish hands for over 2,000 years. An exciting day in biblical history. And also we know that Jerusalem has spiritual significance because this is the city that Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah, is going to return to rule and reign. And if we have our own government, the British government, who decide to align British foreign policy with God's foreign policy regarding his plans and purposes for Jerusalem, then this will command an incredible blessing. And this is what we want for our nation. We want our nation to be blessed because we know that in our relations with the Jewish state, our relations haven't always been honourable. We have opposed the establishment of the modern state of Israel, despite the fact that we wrote the birth certificate for the modern state of Israel with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And at the same time, if it wasn't for the British and Anzac forces who liberated Beersheba, that letter would have had no meaning. As we know that the Ottoman Empire that controlled that area, which is now Israel, aligned itself with Germany in the First World War and therefore became an enemy of the Allies. And so therefore the Ottoman Turks were an enemy. And we saw it liberated then, Jerusalem liberated by General Allenby on the 17th of November 1917.
Yeah, and it continued. The British government of Lord George then proceeded to ratify the Balfour Declaration through the San Remo Conference of 1920 to prepare for the re-establishment of the nation-state of Israel. In 1922, the newly formed League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, gave the British a mandate for Palestine to prepare the British people.
The Jewish people.
The Jewish people, not the British people, the Jewish people for self-determination. In the 1920s, the British government, through the Foreign Office, reneged on the Jewish people, fearing that the Jews would build a paradise of a country and the British would lose their control and influence in the region. In April of 1921, the British governor Herbert Samuel of the British Mandate appointed the extremist Hajj al-Husseini as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, sparking hatred towards the Jews of Palestine and essentially starting the Israeli-Arab conflict. And by the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism and fascism on the continent of Europe, the British government of Neville Chamberlain produced the white paper that prevented Jewish people from fleeing the Nazis to find a safe haven in the British Mandate of Palestine, which could have saved over 1 million Jews' lives from the Holocaust.
Which is absolutely incredible. And so therefore we look at this kind of history, and then also after the Second World War, it was the government of Clement Attlee and also the notorious Ernest Bevin, who was the Foreign Secretary, who's known as being a Jew hater, prevented Holocaust survivors from actually entering into the only place that wanted Jewish people, and that was the Jewish communities living in the British Mandate of Palestine, who wanted their own state. They became disillusioned with the promises of the British not to actually give them their own state, and they felt there were elements within those Jewish communities, namely the Ingram and the Stern groups led by Menachem Begin, who believed that if they didn't overthrow the British by force, then no one is going to protect the Jewish people, and the Jewish people could face another Holocaust. And of course we have the whole story of the Exodus ship of 1947 that comprised of mainly Holocaust survivors who had managed to survive the horrors of the Holocaust on their way to safety, and then were fired upon by the British Navy and then sent back to even internment camps in Hamburg in Germany, which was absolutely a horrific ordeal for those survivors on the Exodus ship. But that became the symbolic symbol of the Jewish resistance and nationalism and patriotism, this idea of re-establishing the modern state of Israel. So we also then know in Israel's War of Independence in 1948, and having visited the Israeli Tank Museum at the Latrun, realized that the British had American Sherman tanks. And in order to stop the Israelis getting the tanks, they drove them into the sea, so they'd actually be useless. They actually armed the Arab League in its war, and it was actually commanded by a British officer called John Bagot-Glubb, who led the Arab Legion in its war against the fledgling Jewish state in Israel's War of Independence. So, we see here that that Britain went against its promises of the Balfour Declaration, turned its back on that, prevented Jewish immigration into the British Mandate of Palestine during the Second World War that could have saved over 1 million Jewish lives from the Holocaust. And now, during Israel's War of Independence, when she was outnumbered, outgunned, we see the British were actually arming and fighting with the Arab League against Israel. And of course, we then see that Britain abstained in the UN 1947 partition plan vote when the United Nations voted to partition the British Mandate of Palestine between an Arab state and a Jewish state, and the British government abstained.
So following those initial early day plans, that Britain was really proactive in consistently, the UK was siding with those who had very ill intentions for the Jewish people in Israel. And yet Britain did fight with Israel against Egypt in the 1956 Suez War. At the same time, you can see there's definitely tension. If you have a nation state that's formed or that's functioning in a healthy way, you would expect that Britain, with its input especially, would send some representative, particularly a prime minister, to visit. But the first prime minister to actually visit Israel was not until Margaret Thatcher in 1986, which is, a significant bit of time. You're talking almost 40 years after the formation of the State of Israel. It's extraordinary. Disrespectful.
And of course, our late beloved Queen Elizabeth II as well never got an opportunity to visit Israel or the Holy Land, primarily because of the British Foreign Office's objection to the State of Israel, where they felt that the whole problems in the Middle East is Israel's so-called occupation of Judea and Samaria, or how the world wants to term it, the West Bank, and that this is preventing peace from breaking out in the Middle East, if only things were so simple. But also we see that in 2016 we started to see relations between Israel and Britain flourish, primarily because then the British people decided to pull out of the European Union, and by leaving the EU we were free to pursue our independent foreign policy again. And this is also one of the big reasons why our two nations are developing such a very, very close tie. And of course, Boris Johnson presided over that, what was known as the golden era of relations between Israel and Britain, and having the most pro-Israel cabinet since probably the time of the Balfour Declaration of Lloyd George's cabinet, which is incredible.
And now our Prime Minister Liz Truss has the opportunity to cement that relationship and to see that grow, but not if our beloved Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of Westminster have something to say about it.
No, absolutely. But I think also we see that Liz Truss will be following in the footsteps of President Donald Trump, who in December 2017 announced that he was going to move the embassy from its location in Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he fulfilled that for Israel's 70th anniversary back in 2018. Yeah, Israel's 70th anniversary as a nation reborn. So let's revisit that historic moment when the US embassy was opened in Jerusalem back in May of 2018.
It's very exciting here at the site of the new U.S. Embassy. That excitement is reflected in today's Jerusalem Post, which says, "Promises made, promises kept. Thank you, Mr. President." The White House delegation is represented by Ivanka and Jared Kushner, and there's dozens of U.S. senators, congressmen, and women here attending the ceremony, as well as members of President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. President Trump himself will be making a video presentation during the ceremony. And all of this excitement comes 70 years to the day after U.S. President Harry Truman was the first world leader to recognize the State of Israel. And Christians and Jewish leaders believe today will be a blessing to the U.S. and to Israel.
I think America is coming in alignment with biblical truth.
The Bible mentions Jerusalem and Zion almost 1,000 times. It's also been the capital of the Jewish people for 3,000 years.
This has been a theme that's in our spiritual DNA. And therefore, when the President of the United States moves the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital, he is addressing something at the core of Jewish identity.
That history started thousands of years ago when King David captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. 400 years later, the Jewish people are expelled for 70 years to Babylon, then returned to rebuild the Second Temple with the help of Persia's King Cyrus. Former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Dory Gold says Trump's embassy move might even compare to that biblical king.
That was a huge charitable act on his part, which is in our historical memory. And the fact that now President Trump is going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem puts him in a special category, and perhaps even the category of the ancient King Cyrus of Persia.
Fast forward to 1967 and the Six-Day War, when Israel reunites Jerusalem under its sovereignty. Then in 1980, Israel officially makes Jerusalem its capital, and countries worldwide move their embassies from the city in protest.
The Christian embassy was founded after 13 national embassies left Jerusalem, and it provided a unique moment where the Jewish people were willing to accept our hand of friendship.
David Parsons is with the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem. As a lawyer, he helped draft the Jerusalem Embassy Act, passed by Congress in 1995, mandating the embassy move to Jerusalem.
And now, 22 years later, after all these delays and waivers, it is back to our order. Trump has recognized Jerusalem. The ambassador is going to be working here, and then they're going to start building the building. So it's sort of a moment of personal vindication for me.
Tony Perkins and Michelle Bachmann are on President Trump's Evangelical Advisory Council. They said the move will be good for the U.S., other nations, and Mideast peace.
The scripture is pretty clear on that, and that those who bless Israel will be blessed.
Israel's enemies have always fought on the propaganda argument of words, the fact that Israel was illegitimate and had no right to this land. President Trump, excuse the pun, played a Trump card. He's taken that argument off the table. He said, look, we aren't going to even talk about this anymore, that Jerusalem is or isn't Israel's. It is. We're making a decision. It is.
President Trump's decision effectively recognizes the western part of the city as Israel's capital. Most holy sites are in the eastern part. Gold says only in a united Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty would those sites be protected.
Jerusalem's been the capital of the Jewish people for 3,000 years. I don't see that changing. I think as long as we have freedom of worship, freedom of access guaranteed, I think that many in the Arab world will acquiesce to the idea that Jerusalem remains the undivided capital of Israel.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, at the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
And so that's led us now to this particular point in time, Simon, where now the U.S. has its embassy in Jerusalem, long awaited, and there were many presidents prior to Donald Trump who acknowledged that this would be the ideal, but they just kept signing waivers saying, okay, we're going to delay that, not yet, not yet, not yet. Trump actually bit the bullet, and we saw the embassy moved to Jerusalem.
And did the Middle East go up in flames after he announced the move of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? No. Because I was there on a Revelation TV tour of Israel and Jordan. We'd just come back from Jordan, and we heard the announcement that President Trump was going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. I remember going on the coach, and we were driving through the old city, and by the Damascus Gate you had the world's cameras outside the Damascus Gate, ready for all the violence and the riots to kick off. And you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. So I don't think Liz Truss has anything to fear in doing that, but she does face a massive battle on her hands. She has come out recently in the Conservative Friends of Israel's meeting at the Conservative Party conference in the week of the 22nd of September, after the 22nd of September, to say she's a strong Zionist, which is pretty unprecedented for a British Prime Minister. And we know that she has a very close friendship with a former counterpart, Yair Lapid, who was Israel's foreign secretary, now he's the Prime Minister, so they have a close relationship. So I think every time he sees her, he says, well, you're going to move the British embassy to Jerusalem. So yeah, it could be working. And, I was reticent to say what to expect from Liz Truss, but if she can pull this off, I think she will then also command a blessing for our nation, and our nation needs this. But it's a massive battle. But share with us how this course or this policy decision to radically overhaul British foreign policy to move the British embassy to Jerusalem came about, Reagan.
Well, so on September 22nd, you mentioned this close relationship Truss has with her counterpart in Israel, Yair Lapid. A Downing Street spokesman commented that recently Liz Truss met with Yair Lapid at a meeting in New York. They discussed her review of the current location of the British embassy in Israel, as we said before, currently in Herzliya, but now announced to be in sort of a provisional way. They're planning to move it to Jerusalem. Transferring the embassy to Jerusalem, though, would be a major shift in UK government policy, as like most countries, it does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over the city, despite Israel having sovereignty over the city. It would also follow the lead of Trump, as we've already said, the former U.S. president, who controversially moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem in 2018. But as you said, very little happened that was negative in the aftermath of that. In fact, across the Middle East during Trump's presidency, you could make a case that there was unprecedented levels of peacemaking between Israel and former nations that were enemies, or at least had little goodwill toward the nation of Israel. So this idea that this was definitely going to lead to riots and further unrest, I think is severely overstated, and also for Christians lacks perspective of God's blessings upon those who bless Israel. Israel for years has lobbied its allies to move their embassies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, although, as we've said before, the United Kingdom has not always been a very faithful ally to the people of Israel. So far, only the United States, along with Kosovo, Honduras, and Guatemala, have taken such a step. So not exactly a very large company have done this.
Yeah, I know some more European countries like Hungary and also the Czech Republic were looking to move their embassies to Jerusalem, but they were then threatened by Chancellor Merkel and threatened with possible economic sanctions if they did so. So the fact is that Liz Truss will be breaking a mold, is breaking the mold and radically overhauling British foreign policy on the issue is something absolutely remarkable. And according to the Daily Telegraph, they had a source familiar with the discussions said that Ms. Truss, who first raised the idea in a letter to the Parliamentary Conservative Friends of Israel, seeks to challenge Whitehall orthodoxy and take a fresh look at things. And it's unclear how long the review will take, whether Ms. Truss made any concrete attempts to change the status of Jerusalem, and her previous role as Foreign Secretary is unclear. But this source says that I understand the importance and sensitivity of the location of the British Embassy in Israel, she said in a letter to the CFI over the summer, raising the proposal. I've had many conversations with my good friends, Yair Lapid, on the topic, acknowledging that I will review a move to ensure that we are operating on the strongest footing within Israel. Senior Conservatives earlier this week also called for the embassy to be moved to Jerusalem at the event organised by Conservative Friends of Israel, a pro-Israel lobby group at the ruling party's annual conference in Birmingham. Speaking on the event, Jake Berry, the Conservative Party chairman, pledged his unwavering commitment to build strong relationship with the State of Israel and to support in its fight to ensure that it remains safe and that the capital in Jerusalem is the home to our new embassy, which is quite incredible. But I also want to read out the statement now. This is from the British Foreign Office website, their status on Jerusalem. And this headline is called, "The United Kingdom's position on the status of Jerusalem is clear and long-standing." It says the United Kingdom's position on the status of Jerusalem is clear and long-standing. It should be determined in a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The final determination of Jerusalem must ensure that the Holy City is a shared capital of Israel and a Palestinian state, granting access and religious rights to all who hold it dear. The United Kingdom opposes unilateral action in Jerusalem. Absence of a final status settlement remains supportive of the historic status quo. The UK recognises that Jerusalem and the holy sites at Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount, hold particular significance for many groups around the globe, especially to the three Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Islam and Judaism. The UK welcomes language in the resolution reaffirming the special significance of the holy sites and the city of Jerusalem for these three religions and calling for the respect of the historic status quo. And before we go on this one, talking about the status quo, Jews are not allowed to pray up onto the Temple Mount. So how is that freedom of worship? And also the fact that only under Israeli sovereignty have the holy sites to Judaism, Christianity and Islam been protected under Israeli sovereignty under the city. So what we're seeing here is a radical change in British foreign policy.
And yet there is much opposition. There, unsurprisingly, is political opposition. Again, unsurprising from Labour, which you would think that Labour would desire to stay out of some discussions, given its recent history and accusations of anti-Semitism. They don't particularly strike one as a trustworthy source to look to for an opinion that's objective on Jerusalem. But a Labour spokesperson commented that our position on this hasn't changed. Labour does not support the move. We do not want the move to happen, and we will oppose it. And the spokesperson, however, did not answer specifically whether Labour would reverse a potential location change were it to form the next government. I think that would be highly unlikely that they would be able to reverse. If that embassy had been moved, it would be politically
it would really damage relations.
Horrifically, almost irreparably. Layla Moran, the Liberal Democrat foreign affairs spokesperson, remember that Liz Truss, she was only a few years ago a Liberal Democrat herself. Moving the UK embassy in Israel to Jerusalem would be a provocation, Layla Moran said. The UK should under no circumstances be taking steps which risk inflaming tensions and damaging the prospects of peace. Interesting. Moran, who is the first British MP of Palestinian descent, said she had written to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, to make clear that moving the embassy should only come as part of a negotiated peace settlement between Israel and Palestine. This review should accordingly be stopped, she said. My energy is in stopping this move from happening in the first place. Now, in regards to a negotiated peace settlement, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, Israel has been striving for some sort of peace settlement for years. There are certain terms and conditions that Palestine has simply not met or been willing to meet when there have been ceasefires. The ceasefires have been broken time and again. When there have been indicators of progress. There's been assassinations or there's been intifadas, when there have been moments where things seem to be loosening up and lightening up a little bit in regard to the tension. The tensions seem to flare generally directly as a result of Palestinian terror organizations causing them.
Yeah, we have to go back, I think, to 2000 with Ehud Barak's stupidity in offering the Palestinians not only their own state, a Palestinian state, but also all of the old city of Jerusalem. And of course, then that led to the Second Intifada, a kind of suicide terrorism war against Israel. And so the Palestinian Arabs were given their own opportunity to have Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, as their capital, as well as a Palestinian state, in something like 96% of what is Judea and Samaria, apart from some of the big Jewish settlements there. And Arafat rejected that offer of peace. And of course, what we've seen then is that, yeah, if Israel did make peace with Mahmoud Abbas, and let's just say for argument's sake they wanted that, and that Israel recognizes a Palestinian state, and that East Jerusalem and the old city with the Western Wall and the Temple Mount is given to the Palestinian Authority to be under their sovereignty, do you think that there would be peace? No, this is the start of the conflict. And who's to say that Fatah of the PLO will remain in power? And if the Palestinian Arabs living in the Palestinian territories have an opportunity to vote on their government, they're more likely to vote Hamas. So the prospect of peace is so far away, it is not even achievable. And this is also, we're dealing with Jerusalem. This is God's eternal city. This is being given sovereignty by God, and has brought this nation back. It was pretty much a dead city with very few inhabitants until we started seeing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, starting in the 1880s, going through all of the 20th century, where we've seen Bible prophecy being fulfilled. And this is now an incredible, exciting, dynamic, and beautiful city in which has Israeli sovereignty. And of course, in 1980, the Israeli Knesset passed a law extending Israeli sovereignty over the entire city of Jerusalem. And there's only been one people group that have ever been identified with Jerusalem, and it's the Jewish people.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet we have the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of Westminster directly going against this and directly saying this should not be happening. On Monday, the 10th of October, Archbishop Justin Welby made a statement saying that he is concerned over Liz Truss's controversial suggestion to relocate the British embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv, the Herzliya suburb of Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem. He spoke out against her comments, claiming it would be inappropriate. So he's concerned. He says he's concerned. It would be inappropriate to relocate the embassy. Why? Because he says the status of Jerusalem, which both Israelis and Palestinians claim as their capital, is among the most sensitive and contentious issues in long-running conflict, and he's concerned that this will flare up tensions. And it's sad because here we have Welby given a place, given an opportunity, responsibility to respond positively, and instead of being bold, he's taken the opportunity. Tragically, it's a bit par for the course with Welby to sit on the fence, maybe in his mind, but actually he's not sitting on the fence. The reality of this concern that he's expressed, it invariably falls over and shows support for the Palestinian cause over that of Israel's right to self-determination.
And of course, Justin Welby is also, I mean, does he have a right to speak out on British foreign policy anyway? That's the first thing. We know, for example, without any shadow of a doubt, that all the holy sites are protected under Israeli sovereignty, which wouldn't be the case if the Palestinian Authority was under control of East Jerusalem, including the old city of Jerusalem. None of those sites, like the Western Wall, the Jewish people would have access to. Even the British, when we were in control of Jerusalem, we prevented the Jewish people from praying at the Western Wall. It wasn't until Israel's war in June 1967, and with the famous Israeli paratroopers there that stormed the gates in the old city, the Zion Gate, stormed into the plaza, as known as the Western Wall Plaza, tore down the walls, and then started praying at the Western Wall. And that was the first time in over thousands of years that the Jewish people were able to do that. So we know that freedom of worship has only been guaranteed under Israeli sovereignty. And we also saw that President Trump moved the embassy in 2018. There were no riots. This didn't damage the peace process in any way. All it meant is that we recognize Israel's sovereignty over their eternal city, Jerusalem. And also what people are not taking out is the practicalities of this. The entire government of Israel's apparatus of its state are based in Jerusalem. They're not based in Tel Aviv or Herzliya. And so therefore you've got a logistical nightmare of traveling up from Tel Aviv or Herzliya, which is a city just north of Tel Aviv, to go to Jerusalem and to meet with Israeli representatives in their government body. So, I mean, who else would have an embassy, for example, outside of a nation's capital city? So, for example, say, that the British government didn't recognise American sovereignty over Washington, D.C., and instead saying we're going to base our embassy in New York because this should be the real capital of the United States. I mean, how offensive is that? To begin with, to know that the functioning of the US government are all in Washington, D.C. That's where the British embassy is. So therefore, it's only natural that we should have our own embassy in Jerusalem as well.
It lacks respect. And yet, for the Archbishop to be pitching in, of course, he has an opportunity, given his status as the Archbishop of Canterbury and the blending of church and state in our Constitution, at least on a technical basis, he could say something constructive here. I'm curious, he apparently is in touch with Christian leaders in the Holy Land. I would be curious to know the names of those people and to who they work with, what churches they are a part of, and if there seems to be any particular bias on those leaders' part. There's not much said about what their take is on this. Yeah, I think if he truly was in contact with Christian leaders in Jerusalem, the majority would probably see the sense of and think that this would be a rational and logical, respectful move.
Of course, we've got to think of the sad plight that many Christians find themselves in, living under the Palestinian Authority. I mean, we've seen that Bethlehem, the birthplace of Christianity, has been decimated over the years, certainly since the Palestinian Authority and the PLO have taken control of that city. There's been a massive wave of persecution. So the way that the Christian leaders, who are pretty either Anglican or Catholic in those areas, feel that the safest thing they can do is to support the Palestinian narrative, that of the PLO, and therefore be hostile to Israel for their own protection. But we've got to realize that the only place where Christianity is actually flourishing in the Middle East right now is Israel. So let's have a look at this CBN news item. It's a couple of years old, talking about a conference of Anglicans in Jerusalem, where they're calling for the Archbishop of Canterbury to get back to biblical ideas.
One of the oldest Protestant denominations in the world is experiencing a crisis, one that could define its future for generations to come. As Chris Mitchell reports, it's an ongoing battle between today's culture and traditional Christianity.
The face of the church around the world is changing, literally.
The leadership of the global church, without doubt, has passed on to the global south. And Africans are taking a lead. And this is a cause for great celebration. It's not the white man, or it's a religion of the Middle East, it's a religion of Africa, it's a religion of Asia. So for me, this is absolutely encouraging.
During this recent gathering of Anglicans in Jerusalem, it became clear one of the world's largest Protestant denominations is refocusing efforts to spread God's word to the nations.
What's so encouraging is that we have many people here from Africa or Asia. These countries only received the message of the gospel 150 or 200 years ago. They have believed the gospel, they remained faithful, and now God has sent them to us, especially in the West, to remind us that we must return to our gospel roots.
People in the U.S. would recognize the Episcopal Church as part of the Anglican Communion. The goal of this Jerusalem meeting was to create a roadmap for the future of this church body. It began in 2008 to uphold traditional church teaching and emphasize the critical importance of the Bible. Archbishop Stanley Antagali from Uganda believes this group exists to maintain the purity of the gospel.
It's all about Jesus, all about mission, evangelism, preaching the biblical gospel, so that we do not divert from the biblical truth. We remain focused on the Bible, the authority of the Bible, the teaching of Jesus Christ.
Those teachings led Archbishop Nicholas Oko from Nigeria to call on the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Anglican Church, to repent.
We would like him to know that a big chunk of people he's leading are complaining very badly about his direction, his trajectory. And so we would like him to change. That is to say that they must make a definite stand of repentance.
Representatives here address differences with those leaders and churches in a letter calling them schismatics who have departed from the teaching of the Bible and the historic doctrine of the church.
We must return to being faithful to Jesus despite what the culture is telling us.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
We continue to pray that there would be many turning to Yeshua as Messiah in the nation of Israel, and we're thankful for that freedom as well that Christians have that they don't enjoy in other Middle Eastern countries to nearly the same extent, to proclaim who Jesus is and to call people to consider Christ. Now, it's not just the Archbishop of Canterbury. We also have the Roman Catholics, the Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster and President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, has also challenged this move, I think even in stronger terms than the Archbishop of Canterbury. According to an article in the Jewish Chronicle and a thread on Twitter on this past Thursday, Cardinal Nichols said, "I've written to the Prime Minister to express profound concern over her call for a review of the location of the British Embassy to the State of Israel with the suggestion that it might be moved away from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem." He goes on to say, such a relocation of the UK embassy would be seriously damaging to any possibility of lasting peace in the region and to the international reputation of the United Kingdom. Pope Francis and the leaders of churches in the Holy Land have long called for the international status quo in Jerusalem to be upheld in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions. The city must be shared as a common patrimony, never becoming an exclusive monopoly of any party. I can see no valid reason why a move needs now to be considered. I asked the Prime Minister earnestly to reconsider the intention she has expressed and to focus all efforts on seeking a two-state solution in which Jerusalem would have a guaranteed special status. So very strong words there from Cardinal Vincent Nichols, expressing his concern on behalf not only of, it's not just his own personal opinion, he brings Pope Francis himself into this.
Because we know that the Pope in particular and also the Vatican want total control of Jerusalem. And they have done for centuries. So, also sent out the Crusades as well to defeat the Muslim occupiers of Jerusalem back in the Middle Ages. So we see that this all has historical value, but I think it's so important to unpack what God says and what the Bible says about Jerusalem. So in Psalm 122, it talks about the need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and in verse 6 it says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces." And how important it is that we are commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that God's presence would be there. And also we see that two huge milestones in biblical prophecy passed in the 20th century. First with the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel, 14th of May 1948, and then with the unification of Jerusalem in the War of 67, known as the Six-Day War in June 67, where the Israelis claimed complete control over their city. But also the Bible talks about Jerusalem being a cup, an unremovable stone, or a burdensome stone.
Yeah, and in Ezekiel chapter 12, verse 2 and 3, it says, "Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem. On that day, when all the nations of the earth gather against her, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples." Are the nations alert to the dangers of dividing Jerusalem as proposed by the UN, EU, State Department, and our own Foreign Office? I mean, here's the reality is we look at where the world is going, and when we then look at the Old Testament, we do have to understand there are prophecies yet to be fulfilled. And if you're a church leader, or perhaps if you encounter a church leader who has this idea that everything there in the Old Testament about Jerusalem, about Israel, it's all spiritual and it's all about the church, I would really encourage you against that, because that's not at all a biblical take. That's not at all consistent with any other area of interpretation. We interpret the prophecies literally concerning Christ's first coming. Why are we different when it comes to the second coming, when we consider the promises God makes about Jesus in the Old Testament, in the way that they directly and literally are fulfilled in Jesus? Why then do we question the promises of God pertaining to Jerusalem, the Jews, Israel as a whole, and in relation to the pros of the blessings on Jerusalem, but also on the curses of those who go against it? Why do we interpret that symbolically? Could it be because there's an element of conviction we don't want it to be true? In some ways, I do think there's a lot of anti-Semitism that goes on, and for whatever reason, we don't like the idea of the Jews having any ongoing role in God's covenant plan. It's very clear. Paul says in Romans they do. He makes it very clear that there's an ongoing
But it shows you how out of step our so-called faith leaders are, including the head of the Catholic Church in this country, and including Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And this is why I've titled the programme, "Are our religious faith leaders on a collision course with the God of Israel over the issue of Jerusalem?"
They don't think God will curse them.
Because they are. This is the most scary thing. If these leaders understood their Bible, if they read their Bibles, if they read the Old Testament, they read the New Testament, they would understand that Jerusalem plays a central role in God's end time plans. And this is the city that Yeshua HaMashiach is returning to rule and reign from. And that the God of Israel has enabled Israel to have, again, sovereignty over their eternal city, means that we should align British foreign policy with that of God's plans and purposes for Jerusalem. Instead of supporting Satan's plan of dividing the city and destroying the city, we should have our religious faith leaders in this country recognize that it's the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who we serve, and he's made an everlasting covenant with the people of Israel. And we've seen his promises being fulfilled with the fulfillment of biblical prophecy as it relates to the Jewish people regathering back in their land again, and Israel being a nation state again. But I know that, for example, that Liz Truss not only has a political battle on her hand, but I think we've outlined in this programme as well that she's now got a massive spiritual battle on her hands if she wants to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem. But if she has the fortitude, the courage to do so, this will transform our nation spiritually, means that we will then command a huge blessing. This will be a complete new chapter in British-Israeli relations. After we betrayed the British people during the years of the British Mandate, we prevented over 1 million Jewish people fleeing from the Holocaust safe haven. And we even helped and equip Israel's enemies to destroy the young Jewish state at birth, but we know that God is sovereign. That didn't happen. And again, I think we need to call Justin Welby out on this one.
Welby and Cardinal Nichols, in their statements, are being very short-sighted. I believe this is, as you've already indicated as well, due to a lack of right theology, due to an over-spiritualization of God's covenant promises that He makes to Israel as a nation, as a people, a specific ethnic religious people in the prophetic writings. You can go back, there wasn't, Simon, always this reticence among British Christians against Israel. There wasn't always this skepticism or this attitude of arrogance, really,
Absolutely.
which Paul warns against. He says, would you be arrogant against the natural branches? You shouldn't be. These are the natural branches, part of the God's covenant promises. And so in the past, you can even look as recently as the 1800s with the Bishop of Liverpool, J.C. Ryle. You can look at the Baptist pastor, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. They both spoke quite prophetically that there would be a resurrection of the nation of Israel in a literal way, in its own place, in its own land. I have here, this is just from a message from Charles Spurgeon on Ezekiel 38, and he's dealing with some of the objections people have, trying to spiritualize it, trying to act like Ezekiel 38 is speaking of the church being resurrected and revived and Reformation and all of this. His first point, after doing away with the symbolic element, is first there is to be a political restoration of the Jews, and he makes very clear that Jerusalem is going to have a central place of this. This is what the scriptures say. He says there's not going to be 2, nor 10, nor 12 different nations in that patch of land, but one Israel, praising one God, serving one king, and that one king, the son of David, the descendant Messiah. And he goes on to just talk about the significance where there is going to be a physical and political restoration. And that physical and political restoration involves Jerusalem. Jesus is really going to stand on the Mount of Olives because God promised it.
Absolutely. And of course, also understand Genesis 12, 1-3, that I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you, means that we'll get a blessing, a spiritual blessing over our nation if we decide to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem, and we'll be aligning our foreign policy with God's policy towards Jerusalem and the status of Jerusalem. Whatever we might think of Liz Truss and the Conservative Party, we know for a fact that this would never happen under the premiership of the Labour Party and its leader Keir Starmer, even though he is very supportive of the Jewish community and has done a lot to root out Jew hatred within his party. He would not have the courage to move the embassy. So I think it's essential that we call our Christian religious leaders to account over this issue, but we also need to pray for Liz Truss as well, our Prime Minister, that she has the courage to do this, because this could be a defining moment in British history if she has the courage, determination, and to pursue this policy initiative to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. We definitely need to be praying that Liz Truss would continue to show this strength of character and integrity, and that there will be people around her, Christian leaders as well, who will show support for this and for the nation state of Israel.
Reagan, great doing a program with you, and I want to thank you so much for watching this program at home. Who would have thought the prospect of the British government changing its entire foreign policy to move the British Embassy from its current location in Herzliya, just north of Tel Aviv, to the eternal city, Jerusalem, would have been unthinkable even a few months ago. And so therefore it's an imperative as Christians we pray for Liz Truss that she will have the boldness and the courage to move the British Embassy to Jerusalem, to recognise Israeli sovereignty over their eternal city, that is Jerusalem. And let's remember that Jerusalem is the city of our King. This is where Yeshua is coming back to rule and reign from. So thank you for watching tonight's edition of Behind the Headlines.